I'm at just the right age to have struck social media right when it was actually kind of charming. I never actually had a MySpace of my own, but I got the gist. And I still remember that I was a senior in high school. It was almost the end of the school year. I'm getting ready to graduate and move away for college, and I'm talking to my friend April on AOL Instant Messenger, as you do. And she was like, my friend just told me about this website, Facebook. You need a college email address. Do you have an email address from your college yet? And I said, yes. She said, okay, go sign up and I'll friend you there. And that was it. That marked my life pre-Facebook and post-Facebook. And at the time, Facebook was boring. It was kind of boring. This was pre-newsfeed, so you actually had to go to someone's page to see if they'd updated their status, and people weren't doing that super often. But it was great because there were groups you could join at your college. I was bound for the Savannah College of Art and Design, moving across the country to a school where I wouldn't know anybody. So sure, I'll join this group and see who else is going to be there. I think there was some thread about favorite TV shows, and I was like, I love Mr. Show, which I would still say now, almost 20 years later, but it was a pretty niche show to mention, especially if you wanted people to know what you were talking about. But one other guy was like, oh, I love Mr. Show too. And voila, I had a friend. We were buddies. I had someone to hang out with at school, and we would get meals together. We kept in touch after I left art school. Fast forward to now, we haven't talked in a long time, and he works in the film industry. And a couple weeks ago on Instagram, I see him post a picture of himself at the Oscars. He was part of a team that was up for Best Cinematography. It was great to be able to reach out on Instagram to say congrats and hope he's well. So yeah, social media can be pretty cool, but also sometimes not. As more and more people hopped on the social media platforms, spending so much time on them, some have worried about what it must be doing to us, how it's shaping our social interactions, and also whether it's responsible for things like political polarization. You are listening to Opinion Science, the show about our opinions, where they come from, and how we talk about them. I'm Andy Luttrell. This week, I'm excited to share my conversation with Andy Guess, the rare double Andy special. Andy's an assistant professor of politics and public affairs at Princeton University. He's been on my list of people to invite on this show for a while, but then last summer, 4 papers were released at the same time, 3 in the journal Science and 1 in the journal Nature. These are some of the most prestigious places for papers in our field to be published. And Andy Guess was on all of them. I'm sure he'll want me to acknowledge, though, that these were all big team projects. They were all collaborations with Meta, the company behind Facebook and Instagram, because they wanted to understand how people use social media in ways that might matter for their political opinions. I'm not even going to try counting up the op-eds. Let's just say that social media's caught plenty of blame for things like political polarization. But how often are people actually engaging with political content when they're online? And if we tweak the platforms, do we solve the problems? In our conversation, Andy shares how they were able to dissect how often people on these platforms are exposed to political opinions, especially from people whose opinions differ from their own, and how they were also able to conduct experiments on these platforms. By turning some knobs and levers, could they influence people's engagement on these platforms and even change their political views? Let's get to it. A lot of your work is about digital and social media and its relationship to politics. And I was curious, how much are you a person who is always on social media? How much is your research program born out of seeing things all the time and wondering why they happen versus you can't understand why other people are constantly on these platforms?
If I'm being honest, I think more of my research interests than I would care to admit are driven by my own personal habits, and that certainly, is true about social media. I spend more time on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it, and other social platforms than is certainly healthy for me. And I've been using a lot of these platforms since pretty close to the beginning. And so, and not always as an academic. So I think there's a lot of, pretty natural questions that arise from your experiences of these platforms, but also just the awareness that you get at some point that the way I use these social media tools, or and what I'm getting out of them is not the same as what other people are doing. And I think that's that is an insight that I think has served me well, and I think that sort of comes up again and again when you look at research in this space, that there's a lot of heterogeneity in people's experiences with social media. I'm a political scientist, and I focus on questions related to politics and digital media. And so I tend to focus on the political aspect, the political information that people consume when they're on social media, or what kinds of political information they share with each other, how people from similar or different political perspectives find each other, that sort of thing. But it's really important to sort of keep this sense of awareness that while that may be a very important aspect of how social media works and how it functions in our society, it's only a specific slice of it. And really, for the majority of people, politics is not what they're looking for when they go online. And so that reveals something about how I'm different, and how people who study social media are different from a lot of the users of these platforms, but also how, like, whatever your focus is going to make particular layer or angle of these very multifaceted environments more salient than others.
I think I think in general, as social scientists, right, when you're intuiting about the world, you're only doing so through your own experience most of the time. And it's funny sometimes to see political science work, because you think, well, people who are political scientists are probably at the far end of the curve in terms of like engaging with political content online, or even things like, insights about misinformation sharing having to do with like, oh, people just aren't even paying attention to whether it's true. And academics go like, what do you mean? Isn't that the most important thing about information? And so, like you say, it's sort of surprising to see the number, like the proportion of content that's political in like the average user's feed, from the perspective of someone who's like, well, God, I feel like it's all political when I go on these platforms. So I wonder, have you found in doing this kind of work and actually taking that broad level perspective and seeing like, what are people actually doing? Like, in what ways have you maybe been surprised at how social media functions in general that might have conflicted with your own intuitive hunch as a politically savvy user of these things?
I was surprised at the beginning just to see how low these proportions are, not only for political content, but for news in general. So, that was, I think, surprising at the beginning, but at this point, it's become such a standard finding for me. This comes up all the time, that I think I'm just not as surprised at the kinds of patterns that I see. The other thing is just that, it's hard for me to come up with another example at the top of my mind about what I find surprising about how people use social media. It's just that the median person spends their time very differently than than I do, or than like the median, or your median academic, for example. And that is obviously reflected in social media, but that's reflected in like a lot of things. For example, I watch way less TV, it turns out, than the average American. And, I watch less sports, and I play, I don't play video games, but that's like a hugely important activity for a huge segment of the population. So fortunately, I don't study video games, but I think it's just important to keep in mind how different people's experiences are just on a day-to-day basis, and also just how that affects the assumptions that we make about our experimental subjects, are the ideal citizens in our models, right? The kinds of obligations or expectations that we impose on people from whatever disciplinary perspective that you might have. So I think this sort of reflexivity can be a really, really healthy thing to do, and to do periodically, as anyone whose job it is to sort of study society.
And that has a lot to do with just checking out social media and seeing what people are doing on it. But a lot of what you've done also is get your hands dirty and tinker with these environments that people spend so much time in. And so, I came up as an experimental social psychologist. I know how to randomly assign people to conditions, but it's a whole nother ballgame, I have to imagine, when you're dealing with selecting from millions of people and messing around for large periods of time with something that they're doing every day. And so I'm curious, like, where, maybe just to start, like, what is the potential of doing that? Like, why is that worth doing? And then also, like, what is it like to actually do that? Like, what are the challenges or weird quirks of doing that? Because you could just randomly assign a few people to a couple conditions, but instead, these are the kinds of experiments you're doing.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of my work has been doing that too, right? Doing experiments that are done within the context of a survey that have a handful of conditions and that are relatively straightforward to implement. That was where a lot of my training came from too. I think so there are a few elements here. First, what we're doing for some of the papers that we're discussing is field experiments. So these are experimental changes that we are delivering to random subsets of a real platform's user population, and is altering some aspect of their actual experience of the platform. And so to some extent, the difference between doing a relatively artificial and controlled experiment and doing this kind of larger scale online field experiment is just the difference between doing any kind of survey experiment and any kind of field experiment, which is that you're suddenly dealing with more logistics. Like you're working with an organization, whether it's directly as collaborators or through some other arrangement. So there's just like a lot more planning and implementation involved. You are not bringing people in to the study with a blank slate, right? So a lot of the participants in our study had been on these platforms, so Facebook or Instagram, for 10 years or more, and many of their histories of habitual use of these platforms were different, and also just ingrained and structure the way that they might engage with any kinds of changes that we might want to deliver to them. And of course, it's just the sheer complexity. So, you could imagine that, like, you could come up with any number of certain kinds of changes that you might want to roll out to subsets of users on a tech platform, and it could involve basically an element of essentially like product design or R&D. It's like you have to sort of like design the change that you want to deploy. And then you have to do the actual experiment part. And then you have to collect the data, either the pretreatment covariates, as well as the outcomes, the dependent variables. And so there's just a lot more at play here. And then in terms of, why would we want to do this? What are the advantages of doing a study of this scale and on platform, as opposed to in a setting that we can control? I think there are just a number of questions that have been, in my opinion, out of reach of the standard social science toolbox. I think some of that is just thinking about the role of social platforms from a policy perspective. If you think about a lot of the debates that people are having about, what should platforms do to, give people the tools they need to navigate the information environment and to discern high versus low quality sources of information, and to perhaps encourage people to hesitate before sharing low quality information about the pandemic. So there's been ongoing debates about what platforms' roles should be in these situations, and also what exactly they should do. And a lot of the debates have really been hypothetical. I mean, we have a lot of survey-based evidence and experimental evidence conducted in surveys that give us, I think, some good evidence and some good clues. But at some point, you want to know what happens when the rubber meets the road, and whether or not the base of evidence that we've accumulated off platform actually generalizes on platform. And if so, whether it generalizes to everyone more or less the same, or if it's more effective, among some kinds of users, maybe users who are newer to the platform, right, than other kinds of users. And these are all questions that are impossible to effectively answer without being able to, open the black box in a way and bring the lab, or the tools of the lab into the platform. And so that's sort of the starting point, I think, here with this collaborative project.
It strikes me too that doing this kind of work on social media is just kind of like a more feasible way of looking at the real world using the tools that we have, right? Ordinarily, 30 years ago or whatever, if you wanted to know certain things about how people conduct themselves in their everyday life, like, I don't know, you got to go track them.
Yeah.
Like social media is just like already
Yeah.
tracking people and already displaying things in particular kinds of ways. And it's just kind of incredible that we have this opportunity to go like, oh, this thing got invented that a whole bunch of people are using to inform their worldview. And it's like manipulatable from the perspective of social science.
Yeah, I mean, this is what's been so tantalizing about digital trace data in general, right? Just the fact that huge chunks of the population of the world are interacting with digital tools, and as a byproduct of those interactions, are leaving data traces. And most of those data are contained within private corporations, and are proprietary and are inaccessible to either the researchers or governments, or anyone else. But the fact remains that for a lot of, I think, very important classes of behavior, the relevant evidence is locked up inside of companies. That's certainly the case when we focus on social media platforms. And I think that's been one of the main arguments of the computational social science movement, that basically there's a huge explosion of data of this kind. We need to think about what are the kind of most valid and safest ways of leveraging this data to provide new insights about human behavior, and how do we actually facilitate that access, right, in a way that protects people's privacy. And then I think initially, a lot of the promise focused on just the descriptive insights that we could get, right? So you have the quote unquote big data, right? You have massive, large scale, large N data. We are orders of magnitude bigger than your standard survey sample. You might know less about each observation, right? And each observation might not even be at the individual level, right? We could be looking at retweets or hashtags instead of people. But there's this, I think, general belief that by leveraging these large samples, these large sizes, that we can learn things that we couldn't learn before. And a lot of these initial insights, I think, and the hope behind them was that we could simply describe things that we couldn't describe before. And I believe that that's incredibly important, especially in the digital realm. There are just lots of things about the online information ecosystem, about patterns of behavior on social media that we just don't know, or we assume to be true, but might not be true. And then there's the second level of that, which you alluded to, which is, okay, there's all this data about human beings that has been locked up inside of companies. We can potentially learn some things about what happens there, but also what if we change some of the dials? What would people's behavior look like in some kind of counterfactual version of a social platform? And what would certain tweaks or changes do to various kinds of outcomes that we might be interested in? And so there you're sort of layering this potential of causation through manipulation on top of the descriptive insights that you can potentially get.
Does it ever feel invasive to know what so many people are doing constantly?
Well, yeah, that's a really good question. It's something that I think as a field and certainly as a team on this project, we thought a lot about before we ever started any data collection. We're operating in an environment in which people are justifiably very concerned about the private information about them that could be used by private entities like companies, right? By governments, by researchers, um, and how to actually engage in research while preserving the privacy of the individuals contained in these data sets is a live and active area of research and debate. And so we were sort of operating within this, I think, ongoing discussion. Um, I think the decisions we can talk about the specific decisions we made about how to address these concerns. I think the decisions we made were really good, and I think we set a higher bar for ourselves than is often set for social science research in this area. But I think it's worth pointing out that there is a trade-off potentially between privacy and the amount of knowledge you can extract from these data. I think you can ask, people who work at the census, like that's it's true that you can inject noise into data and you can produce guarantees about anonymity, but that's also going to place limits on the inferences that you can actually make. And so those might be trade-offs that we're willing to accept, but they're ones that probably should be discussed when designing research and making rules about data access.
So we've been hinting at it, but this giant project that you've been involved with, among many others, maybe we can talk a little more details about exactly what that was. So this is having to do with a bunch of insights that you were able to extract from social media platforms, Facebook and Instagram, around the 2020 presidential election. And these came out simultaneously as 4 papers in like the biggest places that science can be published. And so I am curious, like, what was that like the day that this floodgate opened? You'd been working on this for so long. Like, what did that feel like to be on these like 4 massive papers about like a giant question, the culmination of a huge project?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it was incredibly exciting. I was really happy that these papers could see the light of day. From my perspective as an author, I couldn't wait for these papers to get released, right? And so, but then as soon as they were, I was like, oh. Now I don't know what people are going to think. Like, are people going to be like excited? Are they going to be, thrilled at what we were able to achieve in these studies? Are we going to get criticized for the way the research was conducted? Are people going to push back against the conclusions we drew? Are our results just going to leave lots of people unsatisfied? Or are people going to say, oh, we already knew that. That's not interesting. And so it's like I could come up with all sorts of scenarios ranging from like, a firestorm of controversy to just like shrugs. And so I wasn't really sure personally what to expect. I think as a team, we tried to be prepared for all these kinds of eventualities in terms of like being able to like, explain what we did, talk to people in the press who were interested about the papers, and generally just like trying to stand by and like just respond to questions that people might have had. So I feel like more preparation than usual went into the week before these papers were released and trying to game out exactly what the responses would look like. But yeah, I mean, it was really exciting. And I mean, it turns out that academics do still use Twitter, so that was that was one big question I had. It's like, okay, I mean, am I going to post this on Twitter? Like, are people still using it for academic research? And it turns out least a critical mass of people still are. So that's where a lot of the conversation was still happening.
Was it a deliberate decision to have them all come out at the same time? Like, was that an important part of the reporting process for you, or?
Well, let me mention a couple things. So first, this is 4 papers, but there are probably more than a dozen that are still in the pipeline, and that will hopefully be released one way or another in the coming, year or two.
When I saw the number of conditions, I was like, "Oh, teaser!"
Yeah. So it's kind of funny because these 4 papers came out. I think some of them I link is like really easy to talk about them together, right? Like if we talk about the reshares and the chrono feed interventions, I mean, these were actually planned together, and they ended up in 2 separate papers, and it's, I think, relatively easy for the lead authors on that paper to kind of talk about those all together, and they sort of, the results tell a relatively coherent story. But when you look at all 4 of these, I mean, they do, I think, all make sense, but it's really complicated, and trying to explain how they all fit together requires a bit of nuance, and it's it's not hard to convey in a couple of sentences, or like a slogan or a tagline. And I think so having like those 4 papers come out at once was both exciting, but it was also challenging in that a lot of people just want the simple takeaway, like, okay, does social media like have a big impact or not? It's like, well, it depends. But that's just to say that there's going to be more papers that look at different aspects of this. Some might reinforce the conclusions that people have perhaps drawn from these 4 papers. Others are going to look at different angles and might reinforce different conclusions. So this is still just part of the story.
Well, luckily, we have the time here to have a little more nuance than a 2-sentence takeaway. So maybe we can step through some of them. So as I see it, there's kind of these 4 papers that came out, kind of 2 levels of kinds of things you're saying. One more descriptive, like this is how people tend to engage with content on social media. These are the kinds of things people tend to see. And then a kind of follow-up part, which is, well, what if we start to mess around with those parameters and see if that does anything to the consequences of being on these platforms? So if we start with the descriptives, a lot of these are kind of incredible because, as far as I understand, you're looking at all users. Like you're able to just say like millions of people, more or less, but it's not like, some 1% sample, but it's like a huge number of people on the platform. You can actually quantify like, what are they seeing? So how do you approach a question like that, characterizing like the normal day-to-day operations of being on these platforms?
Yeah. I mean, as you can see, we boiled things down to a few key indicators and metrics. And I think, a lot of the interests that the things that we focus on in these 4 papers are things like exposure to content, engagement with content, political content specifically, but also just content in general. And so, and how to summarize those, I think we're usually looking at very standard ways of summarizing data with measures of central tendency like medians or means, and a few graphs showing distributions. But we try to summarize this vast amount of data in the simplest and most straightforward ways possible. I mean, that does mean that we're not always able to characterize the long tails of various kinds of distributions and what's going on in every interesting subgroup of the user population. And so that's one thing to keep in mind with this sort of focus on averages that you tend to get with like large scale research that studies large scale data and tries to make inferences about them.
So what are the sorts of things that you're looking at in terms of people's engagement?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess I'll mention a couple things. So there's this paper on content from like-minded sources. So this is the one published in Nature. So there, what we try to do is characterize the extent to which people are mostly seeing content from what we call like-minded sources versus cross-cutting sources. And we define like-minded sources actually as users. So, users that you're friends with, or pages that you follow, or groups that you're a member of, that are posting things onto your feed. And so the idea is that we can kind of make predictions about whether you're liberal or conservative as a user, and then we can say, oh, if you're liberal, does most of the content that you're seeing on a feed come from other users, pages, or groups that are themselves liberal? Or if you're liberal, are you getting some share of the content on your feeds from conservative users, pages, or groups? That's a slightly different way of classifying content on feeds than you see in some other work. And the reason for that is that we're able to actually classify the vast majority of users by doing it this way. So, more than 95% of the users in this descriptive part of the study, we can sort of classify as being, on one side or the other ideologically. And then because we can do that, we can also say, well, X% of what they're seeing on their feeds is coming from like-minded sources or cross-cutting sources, or neither. And so, one of the takeaways there is that the median user sees just over half of their content from these like-minded sources. Going back to one of the earlier topics that we discussed, what you need to keep in mind when discussing these kinds of results is that the political news and information represents only a small proportion of that content that we're talking about. So in this case, it's less than 7%. So when we're talking about content that's either like-minded or not, we're talking about something that may or may not be explicitly political. And for most people, it's probably not even explicitly political. And then just to give one last result there, just over a fifth of Facebook users get over 75% of their exposures from like-minded sources. So you might think of this chunk of users as, the people who are the most in a kind of echo chamber, where more than 3/4 of the content they see on their feeds are coming from friends, pages, or groups that are classified as like-minded.
Yeah, what's interesting about that too is the fact that it's not necessarily that you're seeing more agreeable content, more politically agreeable content. It's just that you're seeing more stuff posted by people who happen to agree with you more politically, right? So I see you post the blueberry pie you made. That's more likely to be coming from someone who shares my politics than someone who doesn't.
Yep.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. It's really good that you pointed this out, and it's good to keep that in mind. I mean, one way that I think about this is that it taps into homophily, basically. Like one of the most consistent findings in social research, right, is homophily. So people tend to sort themselves into networks of similarity along various dimensions. And you see this in debates about, say, geographic residential sorting. Are people moving, to certain places because they think that the other people there, share their political views? Maybe, but not necessarily, because the things that lead people to move to one place versus another could be driven by other considerations that are themselves correlated with politics. And these kinds of sorting dynamics that we see in offline networks, of course, play out in online networks too. And when we're talking about Facebook, certainly, at least at the beginning, these online networks were built off of pre-existing offline networks. So those homophily tendencies are there, and I think that's at least part of what's being picked up when we talk about this like-minded measure. But not all of it, because we are also talking about some proportion that is more explicitly political.
I also want to give some context to that just over half stat, because when I saw it, I was a little underwhelmed. Actually, it was it's like 50.3% or so, and you go, "Oh, that's like half. Like that's not like oh wow, like there's this asymmetry," but it's more because quite a lot of the content you're seeing comes from people who can't easily be classified as like distinctly liberal or conservative.
That's right. And even, that's important to point out as well. But I think, even if you keep that in mind, there's still probably some debate about whether, 50%, is that a lot or is that a little?
Yeah.
Like what is the optimal amount of like-minded and cross-cutting content that people should be seeing, right? And that's an answer that I have yet to, I've yet to find a good answer to that question. And usually, you see kind of normative statements about this, but they're made in sort of directional terms, like there's not enough or there's too much. But it's really hard to pin people down about what's the optimal proportion of, politically challenging content, for example, that people should be engaging with on a regular basis.
I guess the flip side of the perspective is, and maybe you said it and I missed it, but do you know offhand like how much of that content is from distinctly like opposite ideologically? So like I can quantify like X% of what I'm seeing is from someone who is like identifiably different from me in their political views.
Off the top of my head, I can't give that to you.
But it's not 50, right? It's not like 50-50,
no.
But it's
Yeah, that's right.
So the minority of things that you're saying are from people who you would absolutely disagree with on political grounds.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair to say.
Mm-hmm. So this is observational stuff. It's just an example of the kinds of things you can learn by just, I don't know, I can't even imagine the amount of data, like the actual process of getting to this, right? Like 50.3% or whatever that number is a simple number. But to think of the work it took to get you there.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for mentioning that. And maybe here's a good place where I can plug the amazing efforts and contributions of the larger team of this project. If you look at the author lists on these papers, you'll see that for each one, there's a team of co-lead authors. And, there's like usually 2 to 4 on the academic research side, and then 1 on the meta side, who, we're all working very closely together on these. And then if you look at the rest of the author list, there are quite a few people who also work at Meta. Some of them are researchers, some of them are engineers, and that simply reflects the incredible amount of data engineering work that had to go into, every clean numerical result that you see in every figure and table. A lot of data pipelines had to be built from scratch for these studies. As an academic researcher who I've never worked for Meta, I was learning a lot about this, as the project developed. And so, of course, there's incredibly complex record keeping and data pipelines within Meta, but those are of course tailored, often for products, and evaluation goals, and not so much for the purposes of research or the kinds of metrics that we were interested in for our studies. And so a lot of that had to be built. And it's just so much work. And so like shout out to many co-authors on the Meta side who made that work possible.
And there are lots of incredible results of that huge effort that people can look into. With the time that we have left, I do want to though make sure that we get to some of the experimental work, the interventions that you were able to pull off. Again, I'm sure in close collaboration with engineers at Meta who are able to just change the parameters of a subgroup's social media feeds. So I think maybe, I don't know which one is better to start with. The ones that I think we can hit are the feed algorithm, like how it's determined what you're seeing at the top of your feed versus not. And then also the resharing stuff. So I don't know, feel free to start us off with either one of those.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with the feed algorithm experiment. So what what we did here was we randomly assigned a subset of participants. So here we actually collected experimental samples that are different from the user population wide samples that we were just talking about. So these are people who consented to participate in an experimental research study. So for the people in the feed algorithm experiment, we took a random sample of the people in that group, and we changed the feed ranking algorithm on either Instagram or Facebook so that posts were displayed in reverse chronological order. So the most recent posts are displayed first at the top of your feeds. This is actually how the feeds on both Facebook and Instagram were originally designed. It was just pure chronological, and it remains an option on these platforms as well. And so for a number of reasons, it seemed like sort of a natural kind of thing to test, where we're basically making this now the default for people instead of like an option that they could go digging into their settings and trying to change. It also has some nice policy relevance too. It's been explicitly discussed as a possible solution to the kinds of content like hate speech that is amplified by algorithms and various kinds of public concerns around that. So that was the experiment. We randomly assigned some people to get the reverse chronological version of the feed. We did it for 3 months. So basically September through December 2020. So going through the presidential election in the US. And then, so there are a few interesting things that we learned there. First, just looking at users' engagement. One of the big findings that immediately popped out to us was that the time spent on the platforms went noticeably down. So basically, when you give people the reverse chronological version of the feed, they're spending less time on the platforms. Maybe people are finding it less interesting or less useful. But time spent goes down significantly. We also see more or less across the board less engagement with posts. Another interesting thing is that the mix of content changes. In particular, when you look at where content is coming from. So in the reverse chronological version of the feed, on average, users were seeing fewer posts from friends and more from groups and pages, which makes sense if you consider that groups and pages might be just pushing out posts on a more regular basis and more frequently. So those are some of the engagement level findings that we see. When we look at content categories, so here it's interesting because first, some of what we find just in terms of base rates might be interesting or surprising to people. So in other words, when we just look at the control group in our experiment, which was the people who were left with the default algorithmically ranked feed, we can look at the proportion of their feeds that were classified to be political, the proportion that was designated as untrustworthy, and et cetera. And so those proportions are relatively low from my perspective. So, for example, less than 3% on average of people's feeds in the default algorithmic feed was classified as untrustworthy. So these are by Meta's own classifiers that they use. About 6% of the feeds were classified as political news, 13.5% classified as political content. So just kind of, again, like on a descriptive level, this is what the kind of average feed in our sample looked like before we even did the experimental intervention. And then when you look at how the chronological feed treatment changed those proportions, again, we find some interesting results. So the proportion of content that is either political news or political content goes up. So relative to those baselines that I just mentioned. So another way of saying that maybe is that relative to a chronological feed, the algorithmic version of the news feed is actually showing people less political content and less political news. Also, when you look at the chronological version of the feed, the proportion from untrustworthy sources increases. So it goes up from 2.6% to 4.4%. So that's also potentially counterintuitive. And then we see some changes in terms of like-minded and cross-cutting sources as well. So we see actually that the proportion of content from like-minded sources goes down in the chronological version of the feed, suggesting that in the kind of algorithmic version, like-minded sources are being promoted one way or another.
But not in their political content, it seems, right? Like it's
Yeah.
up,
So
it's showing more from like-minded people, but less political content, which is an odd combo.
Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah. So like-minded here kind of measured in the same way that we were talking about. So those are okay. So that's at the content level. And then since we were surveying people, we can actually look at the result of that experimental intervention on survey measured outcomes. And so we looked at things like self-reported vote choice in the 2020 election, self-reported voter turnout, whether people voted in the election, other forms of political engagement. We also looked at various measures of polarization and knowledge. The main takeaway is on most of these measures, we cannot distinguish the effects from zero. So these are, I think, relatively well estimated nulls. There are a couple of exceptions there that we could talk about. I think maybe one that I'll mention that is pretty interesting is that the reverse chronological feed markedly decreases on-platform political engagement. So we actually have some platform data which allows us to measure on-platform forms of engagement. So things like mentioning a political candidate in a post, saying that you voted, these kinds of things. So it's a very well, there's not a lot of measurement error here. And we find that goes down in the reverse chronological feed. So perhaps the kind of standard algorithmic feed actually promotes some forms of on-platform political engagement. But when we go off-platform, again, we don't really see evidence that people are more or less likely to vote or to otherwise participate in the political process. So one possible takeaway here is that the feed ranking algorithm pretty substantially shapes aspects of your on-platform experience and on-platform behavior, but that doesn't necessarily translate into off-platform behavior.
Okay, so to recap, just to make sure that because that's a lot of stuff, to make sure that I'm on the same page. Yeah. Essentially, you're finding that if you take Facebook and Instagram, which ordinarily have complicated algorithms that show you things that these companies seem to know you want to see, and you strip that off the platform and you say, you're just going to see things as they appear on the platform, that does have a marked impact on what people are doing on these social media sites, right? They're not spending as much time on them. They're acting differently on those platforms. And yet, even though people have been pitching this as the way to solve our societal ills and make changes to the way that people are thinking and acting politically, even though it's not like people don't notice, right? Because it's changing their engagement on the platform, but it doesn't seem to be having any real impact offline in terms of privately held beliefs and opinions and like civic behavior. Does that kind of capture the gist?
Yeah, that's in line with our, I think the interpretation that you'll find in the paper. Mm-hmm. And I mean, one other point just to add there is that reverse chronological feed is very, I think, straightforward, easy to characterize fix. In terms of like when you look at all the experimental changes that we implemented for these studies, I mean, this was a pretty simple one, and would be simple for a lot of platforms to do. But even there, we see that it's not a silver bullet. We also see that there are trade-offs. So if you have a policy goal of, say, reducing exposure to content from untrustworthy sources, or say reducing exposure to hate speech, et cetera. Our study showed that these these kinds of content categories are actually moving in opposite directions, and so you would have to sort of prioritize which you think is more important, or at least consider that you might have to weigh these trade-offs against each other, which is, I think, something that's not been appreciated in these kinds of debates.
One of the findings too that I found really curious that I haven't seen played up as much is, and I believe this is the case, that when people were in the chronological feed, you were able to see that they were spending more time on like Reddit and YouTube, right? So they were moving off platform.
Yeah, yeah.
And so to me, that's kind of the story could be that people crave a certain kind of social media experience. And if Facebook isn't giving it to them, they'll go find it somewhere else. And why would we expect people to change their privately held beliefs if they're able to sustain them off of this platform?
Yeah, I mean, certainly there are many inputs into people's, political opinions, factual beliefs, and knowledge, aside from just what they're seeing on a given day on Facebook or Instagram. And like you said, that includes other platforms as well. They exist in a competitive environment. A lot of people use different platforms simultaneously, and so we were able to do something, I think, unprecedented with these studies, which is to change, some aspect of how these platforms operate for some users and track the results. But we're holding everything else constant by design, including the rest of the online ecosystem. And for better or for worse, often what people want to know is, well, what if we could change like some systemic feature of the online ecosystem, and then see what happens. And that's beyond the scope of the present studies.
Or what is possible at all.
Yeah. It requires more assumptions to make any kind of generalizable statements.
So it seems like these like very compelling null effects on attitudes and behavior were like the real allure of this project, right? It's clear that like we mess around with that problematic tool that everyone blames for, where people are getting their political worldviews, and it's not making a dent in their privately held beliefs and opinions. I'm curious, for you, was that an outcome that you were like, yeah, this isn't going to do anything? Or did you really think like, yeah, like this is going to be the kind of thing that will change people's political views and actions?
I mean, if you look at the pre-analysis plan for this study, which we posted before we implemented the experiments, you'll find that we did expect to see changes on these, on things like polarization and knowledge. And some of that is driven by prior theory. But I think it was certainly reasonable from a standard political science perspective to expect small or minimal effects on these outcomes. But I'm hedging because there are some key things about the interventions we were planning that we didn't know. Part of the reason why we spend so much time talking about, what these interventions did in terms of the immediate mix of content that people saw and just like the way that people use the platforms is that that to us was still a bit of a black box. And so just knowing what would immediately change when people got one version of the feed versus another, just characterizing that treatment was interesting. And I think since we had some uncertainty about how, what the mix of content looked like at baseline, and then also how it would change. I think that depending on what we'd found there, that would have been more or less compatible with large effects on the downstream outcomes. And so now, in retrospect, I think it's easy to say, like, well, okay, if on average people didn't have that much political, content in their feeds to begin with, and it increased by a bit when you move people into a chronological version of the feed, then when you look at that as a proportion of what people are doing elsewhere on the platform, then it does make some sense that we didn't see a lot of movement on political polarization. But that's easy to say, I think, ex post.
Mm-hmm. There's part of it also that I was thinking, like, the interventions are unique in that they're kind of like interventions of absence as opposed to interventions of presence. You're sort of taking the way this platform usually works and you're removing features of them that have been blamed for these problems. And you could say, just like a kid learning to ride the bike, their parents are holding them and then they let go. And the kid continues to roll forward on a bike, right? And so that's kind of the image I have, is that like people have these established political views that may actually have, resulted from engagement with these platforms because of the things that you're toying with, but taking them away for a few months may not be enough to radically change. Whereas like the phenomenon of social media driven change, as people have kind of surmised, is that it was giving people novel stuff that they hadn't encountered before.
Yeah.
And so and maybe, I don't know, some of these secret conditions that we don't know about yet, were a little bit more in that vein. I don't know. I just wonder what you think about that take on this.
I think that's really fair to say. And, one thing I'll note is that, I would love for these studies not to be sort of the final word on anything, and instead to be sort of the beginning of many studies of this kind, with Meta and with other social platforms. And it seems to me this, we answered a lot of questions, but I think our results raise a lot of questions as well. And so, we show that you can change the way that algorithms rank content on your feeds. I think there are lots of other ideas that people have about, alternative, feed ranking algorithms that haven't been tried, or, ways of promoting certain kinds of content, designed for healthier conversations, or promoting, some values over others. And so there's this whole counterfactual world of, what would it look like if we tried something that these platforms haven't done to our knowledge? And that's just looking within a feed. I mean, what if we, move people into a radically different version of, of Facebook that doesn't have a feed, or that operates according to completely different principles? So I think you're right that these studies are, sort of out of necessity and practicality. They're grounded in the status quo and then sort of changing things about the status quo. But looking forward, I can see how, cumulative, research that builds on this can start to think about counterfactual social media experiences that that aren't based on something that the platforms have historically done, or that just comes from like a simple tweak. And that to me is like a big promise of doing this kind of research.
Yeah, it's great, and I'll be very excited to see all that stuff that's still yet to come. And so, just want to take the time to say thanks for coming on here and talking about all this stuff. We'll be curious to see what's coming out next.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate this conversation.
Alrighty, thank you so much to Andy Guest for taking the time to talk to me about his work. The research we were talking about really made a splash last summer and caught lots of attention, so I'm grateful he carved out some of that space to come on the show. You can find more about Andy and his work at andyguest.com, and check out the show notes for links to the 4 big research articles we were talking about. For more about this show, head to opinionsciencepodcast.com. Follow and subscribe at all the podcast places. Shout from the rooftops that you like this show, especially if your rooftop is in a neighborhood where lots of people happen to be interested in behavioral science. But I don't know, any rooftop is good. And I appreciate all the support and kind words about our recent series on behavioral economics. Thank you so much for listening to it. If you haven't, you can go back and find They Thought We Were Ridiculous, which is a 5-part series on the origins and growth of behavioral economics. Next time on this show, in a couple weeks, I'll be back with one last interview from the archives of making that behavioral economics series. We'll hear from David Halpern, who helped set up a unit in the British government to use behavioral science to enhance the impact of public policy. That's in a couple weeks on Opinion Science. But until then, bye-bye.